Spider-Man Homecoming is web swinging its way into theaters very soon, but does this do whatever a Spider-Man movie can? We'll tell you right here on Screen Junkies News.
Listen, Peter, there are people who handle this sort of thing. Can't you just be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man?
Hi, I am Dan Murrell.
And I am Roth Cornett. And surprisingly, that was less of a pun, more of a reference. For a Spider-Man movie, I thought you'd go full punny.
I decided to expand my intro bag of tricks. Roth, we are, of course, reviewing the highly anticipated Spider-Man Homecoming, the second MCU movie of the summer, kind of. It's an MCU Sony co-brand thing, but it's part of the MCU. So it's the second big Marvel movie of the summer. And the first time we've seen Spider-Man since The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a few years ago, which kind of caused this whole rebranding, merging, whatever you want to call it, partnership. It's the sixth Spider-Man movie, the first of this iteration. Of course, we saw Spider-Man in Captain America Civil War. And before we just go into the nitty-gritty of this, overall general thoughts, what did you think of this movie?
Overall general thoughts, I think that this is a very fun movie. It is surprisingly hilarious. Look, we know that Marvel does humor, right? But particularly with Spider-Man, you kind of have to nail that. And I think that's one of the things that hasn't always landed in the past. Sometimes it has, but it lands perfectly here. Tom Holland, as we saw in Civil War, is the ideal casting for this character. It sort of makes you feel bad in a way for some people who have come before him. And that isn't saying anything bad about any of the other actors. He's just, he is the perfect Peter Parker, right? And the perfect Spider-Man. And this film is a lot about him, interestingly, merging those two identities, reconciling those two identities, which was a more nuanced direction than I thought it would go in as just one aspect of the story. So a lot of fun.
Yeah, I liked this movie a lot, and one of the big draws for me was that idea of, you know, we've seen now with Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire the Spider-Man origin story twice, and kind of the same story beats with Uncle Ben twice, and that's always kind of the motivating factor is Uncle Ben, great power, great responsibility, and I feel like that's what people were kind of played out on with Spider-Man. And this kind of looked at it from a different angle. Of course, you know, we know that we've already met Aunt May. There is no Uncle Ben. There's no origin story. He just is Spider-Man, so we don't have to hit that beat again of, oh, I got bit by a spider. What's going on? I think, oh, look at that. I can climb a wall. It's like we've seen that. But I also think that it kind of did an interesting thing with the character where the other Spider-Man movies, when he becomes Spider-Man, like becoming Spider-Man has been about like, oh, I needed to design my costume and I can figure out how to make web shooters, and then, you know, I'll stop one robbery and then I'm Spider-Man. And I felt like this was a movie about becoming a hero and what it is to be a superhero, and the fact that he was thrown into this massive world in Civil War, which, you know, we're directly following the events. They tie this movie in, I think, in a really clever way to Civil War, but it's kind of following in like, here's this kid, and this is the first age appropriate, I think, Peter Parker. Like, he's 15, he looks 15, he's got the problems that an actual 15-year-old has. And here's what would happen if you took this 15-year-old kid who's just figuring out how to do all this stuff and throw him into this larger world. And he's not perfect, and he's going to make mistakes, and he's worships these other heroes. And I agree with you. It took a little bit more of a subtle position at looking like, what is it to mean to be Spider-Man, to be a hero? Yeah,
I mean, there's some of figuring out the suit and things like that, and it's actually done in a very fun way because he literally, it's not his suit. He didn't design it. And so he truly is figuring it out. And Tony steps in, as we know, as his mentor, as he previously did, but even more so in this film, and his proxy, Happy, right? And what's cool about that is that Tony himself is not perfect, right? He doesn't exactly know how to mentor him or exactly know how to guide him and give advice. And he's doing his best to figure out how to be in a father position. Whereas Uncle Ben sort of is this icon. He is this thing for him to live up to. So is Tony, but in a more flawed way.
Uncle Ben was this perfect ghost that would just show up whenever something needed to be solved. Like, now, Peter, remember, with great power, like, it's just like, and I like this idea of he just this thing with Tony Stark being like, I don't know what to do with you, and Spider-Man like, well, I don't know how to be a superhero. What do I do? And then it kind of takes it in.
It
humanizes it in a fresh direction, which is difficult for Spider-Man because we've been through this territory so many times.
Yeah. So there's a lot. You're exactly right. I mean, and he is a teenager, and I think also the age difference in what they've set up sort of creates that dynamic. And he is a teenager, so is also struggling just to kind of be comfortable with himself. And he has this thing which makes him awesome, and yet he's got to keep it a secret, right? And so that's very much there as well. I love the kids. We were promised from Kevin Feige that this would be a film that did not retread the origin story. It doesn't. Spider-Man is Spider-Man from the start, but he's still figuring himself out as any teenager and human is, frankly. And then two, that it would be funny. It's hilarious. And then they had talked about it as being some kind of version of a John Hughes movie, which when it comes to the teen storylines, it really was. And that could easily become very broad, but I loved these kids. I loved
There's
his
one
relationship
John Hughes shout out in particular that I loved.
Yes.
I thought it was a shout out, and then they kind of put a button on it, and I'm like, okay, that's pretty funny. I think that with Andrew Garfield, like I liked his performance, but he looked like a 25, 30-year-old guy in high school. Same with Tobey Maguire. It was like this idea of, it was always about Aunt May and MJ / Gwen Stacy. And even being Spider-Man always revolved around those characters. Like, oh, MJ broke up with me because I'm Spider-Man, and now I don't want to be Spider-Man because I want to be with MJ, right? Or, oh, Aunt May, I have to hide that Uncle Ben, you know, and it was always about like his personal life and like how that got wrapped up in being Spider-Man. And this is much more concerned about like, no, this is just a kid who's a superhero. He's 15 years old. And it's not about like, oh, well, like, you know, it's all about this, you know, there's so many repeated beats.
Right.
And I liked that this was a little bit of a broader take on like, no, this is your life when you're 15 and you're a superhero.
And what we forget is that Peter himself is a special person, right?
Yeah.
Like whether he was Spider-Man or
He's
not,
smart
he's
himself.
really smart. And that's an extraordinary quality that he has. And yet he has these other insecurities and foibles. And then he just has sort of, you know, charming elements to his personality. Ned, I think, helps bring that out a lot and helps sort of ground the film. You need that character there. He works a little bit as a plot device for sure.
Just a bit. Yeah. I mean, they kind of lampshade his role in this movie that kind of comes around in a way at the end. But, you know, we talked about a lot of what we liked about this movie.
Sure.
The cast, the humor, the take on the character. I think these are all really strong things about the movie. Let's talk about some things that we weren't as big of a fan of. And for me, first of all, I think this movie's a little bit too long. It's it's at about 2 hours.
Well, I tend to think every movie is a little too long.
True, yeah. But this one, I felt like for me in the middle, there was like one action beat too long in the middle of the movie before we kind of get to the third act. And this movie does actually take a turn in the third act that surprised me. That like maybe I'm dumb and I was just kind of wrapped up in it, but like I legitimately did not see it coming. I was like, oh wow, and it changes the dynamic of the movie. And then it kind of reinvested me into the movie, and I was on board till the end from there on out. But I felt like the middle, it would kind of like, you have kind of three big action set pieces in the middle of the movie. I think you could have done with two because it started to feel its length a little bit in there for me. So
I actually didn't have an issue with those because I felt like each of the set pieces were a new lesson for Peter, and they served a really specific purpose. There were two reveals that people will probably be talking about when this movie comes out. And obviously we're not going to say what they are here.
No spoilers here.
No spoilers here. I will say that one of them motivated the plot a little more, but I don't know that we totally needed it, but it did motivate some decisions and some character actions. One of them I feel have some questions about that we'll get into in a more spoiler review. So those were a couple of things that I just sort of got taken out by a little bit. In terms of the length, look, the length is never really truly the issue. When I say movies are too long, it's not about the length. It really is about the pacing of any given movie, because if you look at a movie like The Wolf of Wall Street, it's 3 hours long, but you don't really feel it.
No, it feels like it's 2 hours long.
Yeah, it goes like that.
Less than that,
so there are sort of some of those dips and repeated beats, because I think they're trying to very much hit these ideas in a way that any audience member can get it, which I understand in this film, because certainly I hope and imagine that younger audiences are very much invited to be a part of this as well.
Yeah.
I felt like the use of Cap, though, and Tony Stark, well, we've talked about Tony a little bit, was kind of perfection, because it was one of these things where the movie is self-aware, but it doesn't dip into being sort of a meta joke on itself or on Spider-Man. But it's self-aware enough that it references the things that we as the audience would reference. If there is an exposition dump moment, it is aware that it is that, and it sort of explains why it's doing it. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and it's, you know, it's this kind of a weird hybrid of a Spider-Man Marvel movie, and it's a weird hybrid of a Marvel Sony movie, and you could tell that Sony probably didn't want it to be too heavily reliant on the existing mythology. And really, other than a Civil War reference, this is not a movie that's like, oh, you need to see Spider-Man Homecoming to get Thor Ragnarok, whatever. You know, other than giving it the context of tying it in, it doesn't do that. And I was worried that this was going to rely too much on Tony Stark and Iron Man. Yeah. And that they were going to use that as a crutch. No. And I didn't think they did that. They used it as part of the plot, but you know, Robert Downey Jr. is not the third lead of this movie. It is a Spider-Man movie. Yes. Yeah. He plays a part in it, but it is very much a story about Spider-Man, about Peter Parker. There were two characters in this movie that underused. I didn't, well, maybe not so much underused. Well, the two underused, I know you had some issues with Michael Keaton, which I think that he's good, but it's the villain problem, which is if it's a hero story, then the villain's going to get the short shrift. And I again, toward the end of the movie, I liked him a little bit more than I did toward the beginning. He's a little less generic, but he is, at the end of the day, he's a guy in a suit with wings, and they could have given him a little bit more. This
is what I think. I have pretty mixed feelings about it, because I actually don't think he has the same villain problem, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think that they gave him a perspective and point of view that Peter could share in a way. And that actually gave them an interesting dynamic, because when you talk about like the defenders of the street level heroes, right, of the Marvel universe, but in a weird way, what they've done here is allowed Peter to, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, be coming from the little man's perspective. And so I feel like there was actually a cool dynamic between him and Michael Keaton's character. But you have Michael Keaton? Yeah. Let him loose. Let him loose. Yeah. You could have, you know what I mean? Just unleash him. And he could have made an even more extraordinary villain than he did, and that was disappointing. Yeah. But I do think their dynamic was well done, and I do think that idea of putting Peter in that position of showing, like, even though he's a hero, there are things that the Avengers are way too elevated to deal with, and they still need dealing with. Mm-hmm. But the two that I felt were truly underutilized were Zendaya and Donald Glover.
I'm totally on board with you on both of those. I think that, you know, Donald Glover, for all the speculation that happened when he signed on to the movie, oh my God, who is he playing? What's he going to do? He's essentially, you could cut him out of the movie and it would literally make no difference. I mean, I don't know why. It was interesting because, you know, they kind of established him and I'm like, okay, when are they going to loop back to him, or is he going to play some integral role in the movie? And he really doesn't. He's kind of like when you're watching Law and Order, they have to talk to like 8 guys to get to the guy, and he's like guy number 3. It's like, really? That you cast Donald Glover there? I think that was, I don't know if that was just to get a face and more buzz around the movie, but I don't really even know if he's got a role that could pay off going forward. Maybe it could,
and we'll talk.
The spoiler review, but in this movie, I agree with you, completely underutilized. And I have to say, I just did not like Zendaya's character at all. To me, it was like a studio executive's idea of a disaffected teen, and like every scene she's in, she's just like, and it's like maybe it's just proof that I'm old, but that could be part of it. But I thought that all her character had to do was just be like, I don't like that. Oh, look at you dummy. And like, really? That's it? That's all you're gonna give this person to do? I did not like her character.
I thought it's not that I disliked her character, because I thought she was sort of taking on, and I think she's actually, I said this and then I realized, I think she's actually said this, she was taking on the Ali Sheedy role in The Breakfast Club, right? Yeah. But that she's just sort of peppered in for too brief a period, like just little moments, so you don't get to know anything else about her. Right. So in that way, it's too bad. And there's some things in the movie, like most comic book movies, that are set up, and we can tell that they're set setup moments or setup beats.
Right.
And that always feels like it takes me out of the movie, but I feel like if you're not aware of that, maybe it just sort of floats on by you. You know what I mean?
Possibly. I just feel like, again, like with Zendaya, like there was a lot of buzz. Like, oh wow, they cast Zendaya in this movie. And again, the speculation, who is she playing? What's her character? What's she doing? And then to show up in this movie and just be like, oh, I like drawing people in detention because they're sad. It's like, that's all
you sound like Daria.
That's what she acted like, Daria. And that's all they give her to do. You know, again, like with Donald Glover, maybe they're just establishing her character to go forward in different movies. And if when we do our spoiler review, we can maybe talk about that. But I think that kind of a missed opportunity on both of those counts.
Yeah. They took a step closer in this one for me to having a well-rounded, like really fleshed out characters. But it's impossible, I think, in any movie to nail that with every single character, right? So I feel like they did take a step closer, like Loki is a wonderful villain, but they took a step closer with this villain. It wasn't the step all the way. These characters, because of who they are, I think that's what changes the perspective, right? If it hadn't been Donald Glover in that role, you'd just sort of say, okay, that was a moment, that was a plot device. But because it's him, you're wondering why it's him.
Right.
And you come in with these levels of expectations about how he'll be utilized. And that's where I think it feels odd.
It's just strange, just a little weird. So Roth, let's bottom line it. We talked about what we liked, we talked about what we didn't like so much. Spider-Man Homecoming, should you go see it?
Absolutely. Because in total, look, we're going to obviously, any movie, you're going to say, oh, there's this issue and that issue. But in total, the most important thing in this film is that, and again, we saw it a little bit in Civil War, but they nailed Spider-Man and they nailed Peter Parker, and they did it in a way that is fresh. I think you will walk out of this movie being excited that you have this new Spider-Man and engaged in the story because you don't necessarily know what's going to happen next, like we have in the last several iterations. And this is a different twist on his character. It's so amazing to me that they have both perfectly nailed him and giving us something new to learn about him at the same time. So it's really funny. You should be excited to go see it. You should definitely go see it in the theater if you're a fan of this character.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I would definitely recommend it as well. I think it's really, it is a funny movie. It's a fun ride. It's maybe a little bit too long, but I think it is, for me, probably easily the third best Spider-Man movie. I like the first two Tobey Maguires are good. I would put this one third by a very significant margin. I think if you're a fan of Spider-Man particularly, you're really going to love this movie because they do a lot of great stuff with that character. And overall, just as a summer movie, it's a good time, but not at the expense of your intelligence. It's you know, it's well written, it's well characterized, it's well acted, it's smart. I would also recommend Spider-Man Homecoming. So a recommend from both of us.
Recommend. This is the Spider-Man that I think that people were hoping they would get when Marvel got studios got
I think
back
this
involved.
is definitely the take on the character that I think people wanted from Marvel, and they deliver that.
Yeah.
So that's our thoughts on Spider-Man Homecoming. What did you think of the movie? It's coming out July 7th, so you got plenty of time to watch our review and go see it. Let us know in the comments below. And as always, as all of the big summer movies come out, we'll be reviewing them right here on Screen Junkies News. Until next time, thanks for watching.